GitHub has a lot going for it. In this episode, we are going to take a peek at some of what that entails. Welcome to this video on GitHub and DevOps. My name is Kevin Fiesel, and I am the proprietor of Galaxy Services LLC, a consulting firm which specializes in work all across the data platform space, especially SQL Server. We are starting a brand new series on DevOps with GitHub. As is my wont, let's start in the classroom and then try some things out in a demo. This series is based on a Tech Excel training that is available from Microsoft and that I helped write. The intent of this training is to bring people up to speed on two major concepts, Microsoft DevBoxes and GitHub. For this series, I'm going to focus on GitHub and make no further mention of DevBox. At this point, I assume that nearly 100% of my audience knows what GitHub is, and a large majority of you already have GitHub accounts. But just in case, let's briefly hit the basics, and we'll quickly dive into areas that are a lot less well known as we continue this series. GitHub is the most well-known web-based source control system out there. It is based on Git, a distributed version control system that has essentially dominated the source control market. There have been many version control systems in the past, as we can see on this Wikipedia chart. Version control goes back to 1969 with the first release of The Librarian. I started my first real job as a web developer in 2007, and at that point, I'd say the big players in the market were CVS, Subversion, and Team Foundation Version Control, which was then part of Team Foundation Server. On the distributed VCS side, Git and Mercurial were making a lot of noise, with Git hosting the Linux kernel and Mercurial having a nicer user experience for developers. Now, I don't intend this video to be a walk down memory lane, though I will point out that there's a big list here, of which very few options are still relevant. Ryan Donovan at Stack Overflow wrote an article in January of 2023 covering the 2022 Stack Overflow Developer Survey results around version control systems. In it, almost 94% of respondents mentioned that they use Git as their version control system, with SVN and Mercurial being the only other two to break the 1% boundary. Other resources showing relative market shares will give us a similar story. That's why, when anybody asks about source control or version control systems, I simply push them in the direction of Git. Not so much because I love Git, as I actually preferred Mercurial. But trying to use anything else is swimming upstream against a strong current. Now, let's talk GitHub. GitHub, incidentally, is one of the major reasons why Git became so enormously popular. GitHub launched in April of 2008 and has always been a site that supports open source software, providing free repositories to individuals and open source projects. Microsoft bought GitHub in late 2018, and we've seen the core mission stay the same, though there's been a lot of changing capabilities and enterprise offerings. Now that we've got a little bit of history under our belts, let's start going through some lab activities. We're going to spend most of our time working out of this lab scenario, hosted in GitHub Pages. I've included a link to it in the show notes below. As I mentioned in the intro, the lab includes a section on Microsoft DevBox and a section on GitHub, and we're going to focus solely on the GitHub side of the house. That said, if you have an Azure subscription, you will be able to follow along. If not, you can still follow along with a lot of what we're going to do, but there are a couple of videos where we'll work mostly with Azure resources, so you may have to watch rather than do. I'm going to assume that you have a few things installed on your machine. I will have links in the show notes for each of these downloads. First, we want Visual Studio Code. We'll work a little bit with .NET Code in this series, and my IDE of choice for working with most any kind of code these days is VS Code. Next, we'll want to make sure we have Git installed. That way, we can make changes on a local machine and synchronize it with GitHub. The third thing I'll point out is that we will need a .NET SDK. I'm going to recommend you get the latest long-term support version of .NET, which, as of the time of recording, is .NET 8.0. This version has another 2.5 years of support, so it's a stable version. Grab the SDK, not the runtime, as we're going to build code and not just execute it. Finally, I recommend using GitHub Desktop. It's a convenient interface for working with GitHub-hosted source control repositories in a local environment. I use it on Windows, and there's a not quite fully supported version of it for Linux that I use on my laptop, and they both work really well. Make sure you have all of your software installed and ready to go. Also, if you don't already have an account, make sure you sign up for one on GitHub. They are free accounts, and the sign up link is in the top right corner of the page. The process is pretty easy. I personally already have a GitHub account, so I won't be able to show you the process of creating a new one in this video. Next up, we're going to go to exercise 2 of the training. There are a few goals in this exercise. In today's video, we are going to focus on setting up a GitHub repo, so we'll target exercise 2, task 1. We set these trainings up in a narrative fashion, explaining at each step why the customer is interested in what we're planning to do. We'll ignore that narrative in this series, but if you do decide to try things out on your own, this should help you connect the dots on the why for why these steps show up. Our primary goal in the rest of this video is to perform the 2 key tasks we see here. First, we want to fork the starter GitHub repository to our GitHub account. Second, we want to clone the repository to our local machine. In my case, I'm going to use a virtual machine that I've already prepared locally. But before we get to that, let's fork a repo. The first thing I need to do is select the link to the starter GitHub repository. In case you aren't very familiar with the GitHub interface, let's talk briefly about each of these major components. Starting at the top of the screen, we have an accordion menu that shows you options across all of the repositories you own, including any open issues, pull requests, and so on. Next, we have the repository owner and the repository name. To the right of that, we have a search box. By the way, GitHub has a set of keyboard shortcuts you can use. So, for example, the / key is equivalent to clicking on the search box. The little PowerShell looking icon is the command palette, allowing you to search within your issues, pull requests, or other discussions. To the right of that, there's a button letting you create a new repository, import an existing repository, or create a few types of assets, including codespaces, gists, and organization. The next 3 buttons cover loading your issues page. That is, for all issues and all repositories to which you have access, all pull requests, and any unread notifications. Finally, selecting your mugshot will point you in the direction of a variety of things, including your profile, repositories, projects, and a whole lot more. So basically, this top bar is a view of what you have access to across GitHub as a whole. The next line down concerns things within a repository. The first tab shows us the code we check in. The next tab shows us any open issues. After that, we have pull requests. That is, when somebody requests to pull a set of code changes into your repository. We'll spend more time on that in a later video. Actions is the next tab, and these are going to be the star of a couple of videos. The brief version is that GitHub Actions allow us to perform a variety of activities given some set trigger. For example, we could run a set of unit tests on every pull request. Next up is projects, which allow product managers the ability to track work and activities. That will be a part of our next video. Wikis are one way of providing documentation for your repository. Many open source projects have wikis for new users, and I occasionally see private repositories at companies include wikis, but only occasionally. The Security tab covers a few neat features for securing your GitHub repositories, and we will have an entire video on that later. Finally, the Insights tab gives you an idea of who is using and contributing to your repository. On the next level down, we start getting into the weeds with code. We have the name of the repository and its visibility. In this case, the repo is public, meaning anybody can see it. There are also private and internal repositories. Private means only you and people you explicitly allow to see it will be able to, and internal means that people within your organization can view the repo as well as anybody you explicitly invite. Then we have 4 buttons. The first one allows you to pin a repository to your profile. I personally don't really use this, though I suppose if you have some set of repositories you work with regularly, it could be helpful. After that, you can watch a repo. Watching a repository gives you notifications when certain things happen. For example, in this repo, I get notified with any activity, including things like pull requests, issues, and security alerts. The next button is an important one. It allows you to fork a repository. Forking a repository means making a copy of it in your own account. Let's quickly explain why that's important, as it's going to be the first real action we take in this video. You will not be able to make changes to this repository. There are a very small number of people who have the ability to make modifications to this repo, so unless you're one of those people, this repository is effectively read-only. But you can fork the repo, making a copy of it in your own account. Once you fork the repo, you can do whatever you want with your copy of it, including making any changes you desire. If you want to submit your changes back to the original repo, you can by creating a pull request. You can also try to keep your fork of the repo up to date with changes from the original, and GitHub makes it easy to synchronize them that way. Otherwise, you can just fork the repo and go along your merry way, forgetting about the original and just taking the repository and making it your own. The last button is the star button, allowing you to show that you enjoy a particular repo. Now let's talk about the right-hand sidebar. This lets you see a variety of options. For this particular repo, we have a README with some basic instructions. If I select that link, it will jump me down to the README. Next, the repo is licensed under the MIT license, which allows you to use, copy, modify, and otherwise work with this code without restriction, as long as you include the copyright and permission notices. There are also links for a code of conduct and a security guide. We get all of this because there are appropriately named files in the repo. For example, readme.md is a markdown file containing details on the project. A license file describes the exact license arrangements, and GitHub is smart enough to figure out, based on the license text, if it fits into one of a dozen or so commonly used license formats. This one is MIT, whereas I generally release my repositories under GPL version 3.0. After those links on the right, there's a bit more information about activity and utilization statistics. Scrolling down on the screen a bit, we have releases and packages, which are good for products where you can provide an executable for people to run or a library for people to import, rather than needing to build your code from scratch. The contributors list shows who has pushed code into this repository, and the languages list gives you a feel of what's in the repository itself. We can see that C# code makes up about 2/3 of the repo contents. Now let's get into the middle of the page. There's a drop-down list with a branch called main. If I select this, I can switch between any branches or tags associated with this repo. Right now, there's just the one branch and no tags, so there's not much to see here. In a later video in this series, we'll show off some more around branches. To the right of the section, we have a search within files. So if I'm looking for a particular file, I can use this box to search by name. After that, there's a drop-down list to add a file. I can either create a brand new file or upload one from my machine. This is one way to interact with repos, but I rarely use this technique. Instead, I'd rather grab the code locally and push changes that way. But if you just need to make a quick change to a repo, this can be helpful. After that, there is a green drop-down with code. There are 2 tabs associated with this. The first tab is local, which is how we can get this code locally. There are several approaches here. The first is to clone a repository. When we clone a repo, we make a copy of it on our local machine. We can clone using a web URL, via SSH, or by using the GitHub command line interface. If you have GitHub Desktop installed, there's an easy link to clone it with that tool. You can also open it with Visual Studio or download a compressed archive of all of the files. The other tab is Codespaces. Codespaces are cloud-based workspaces that include your code and whatever tools you want to set up. They are effectively Docker containers running on GitHub-hosted hardware and can serve as a quick and easy way to configure a development box against a particular GitHub repo. I don't really have plans to cover Codespaces in this series, but if you do want a video, leave a comment and I may add it to the list. Now let's go down to the final column before we get to our code. We can see the last person who committed a change and the description of the change. In this case, my last change was to fix the bicep template that we use to deploy Azure resources. That was 4 months ago, and we can see a commit ID of 518429 alpha. There have been 8 commits in total for this repo, and I could select the link to see all 8 of them. And the rest of this is just code, broken out into folders however you would like. That's the nickel tour of the GitHub web interface. Now let's do what we need to do, what we came here to do. Fork the repo and clone it locally. I'll select the fork button and that will take me to another screen. In this screen, I select the new owner of this fork, which by default is my account. Because I belong to a few organizations, I could change this using the drop-down list, but it's okay as is. I can also provide a name for the repo. By default, it's the same name as the original repo, but there's no requirement for it to be so. I can add a description to this repository and decide if I want to fork all the branches or just the main branch. In this case, there's only a main branch, so it doesn't matter, and I'll just keep it as is. But in other scenarios, there may be dozens or hundreds of branches, and you can decide how much of that you actually need. Once I'm done, I can select the Create Fork button, and it will make a copy of the repository in my account. This will take a few moments, but once it completes, I'll have access to that repo. Now that I have access to the repo, the final step is to clone the repository locally. For that, I'll use GitHub Desktop. I've already installed it on this virtual machine, but before going to it, let's go back into the code screen and select that green code dropdown. In the local tab, I'll make sure HTTPS is selected and copy the URL. Then I'll switch to GitHub Desktop. In the File menu, I'll choose Clone Repository. Then I'll select the URL tab and paste in the repo link. There are a few ways to clone a repo, but this is one that I like because it's fast and I know I'm getting the repo that I need. I will also need to choose a local path, so let's put it in C:\source code, and then I'll select the Clone button. This will copy the assets from the code repository locally, so I have a copy on the virtual machine itself. This is a freeze frame from the future, cutting my prior self off because this is an important screen I didn't mention originally. We have here two options for how we'd like to use this fork. The first option is to contribute to the parent project, that is, bring those changes back to the Microsoft repo. We are most certainly not going to do that in this video series. Instead, I am going to select the second option, indicating that these changes are for my own purposes. That way, pull requests, issues, branches, and everything else will have my forked copy of the repository as the basis, rather than the original Microsoft repo. This won't necessarily prevent me from messing up and accidentally submitting a pull request against the Microsoft repo, but it will at least reduce the likelihood of that happening because I have to click more things to do it. Alright, back to whatever it was I was saying. If I open up Windows Explorer, I can navigate to the source code directory and I see my folder here. Drilling into it, I can see the same files that I copied, showing that this was a success. That's all I'm going to show in this video, but there's a lot more to cover in this series, so stay tuned. Welcome to GitHub. In this video, we forked a repository and cloned it locally. By forking the repo, we have a version that we can work on without necessarily contributing back to the Microsoft repo. By cloning it locally, we will have access to the code on a local machine, even when we're offline. In the next video, we'll take that forked repository and learn a bit about projects and issues. We'll have links and show notes in the description below, and until we see each other in the next video, take care.